So if everyone's ready, I'd like to dive straight in and introduce our speaker today. It's my pleasure to introduce Anita Davis. Anita serves as the Workforce Development Program Director at the Mid-America Regional Council, and also is the principal and founder of Verify Effect. Anita has a degree in African Studies from KU, a master's in public affairs, and a doctorate in public affairs from the University of Denver. Anita is an expert in economic development and workforce development, and has a particular interest in looking at workforce development from a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens. So yeah, over to Anita to talk about economic development and specifically how it can be a tool to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion principles, and how they are both mutually connected.
Thank you so much, Alex, and what a pleasure to be here and be a part of this very crucial conversation. So thank you all very much. I'm going to share my screen and hopefully just again have a discussion, have a dialogue, talk with you, and really am looking forward to hear your insights as well. So here we go. I hope everyone is able to see my PowerPoint presentation. So I want to talk a little bit, and let me just make sure that I am able to effectively move this. I want to talk a little bit about workforce development in particular. I know in this very important time, jobs are at the forefront and continue to be. And I think workforce development has been an important part of our economic development conversations for a few years. So as I mentioned, some of my objectives today are to really take a look at COVID-19, because we are in such a position where the pandemic really exposed historic disparities, whether that's in public health, education, and employment in other areas. So I want to understand a little bit and share with you some data around the industries and occupations that were impacted, and really those populations that may be most at risk as a result of the pandemic. I want to also touch on why reskilling and rapid reemployment is such a vital part of our economic recovery strategy, and also some challenges that may be present with our current workforce development paradigm, and talk a little bit about the impact of structural barriers to employment, and then present some strategies and best practices that we can promote in our community to help support equity. So nearly 65 million unemployment claims have been filed and were filed since March 13th nationally. And those claims peaked the week of, towards the end of March at about 6.9 million. And as of October, though they started to go down as we opened up the economy, there were still roughly 900,000 claims, which is still 4 times higher than the pre-pandemic rate. And when we talk about equity and we talk about racial disparities, then it's very important to disaggregate the data in order to understand, even now, you know, as our unemployment rate has gone down, when we disaggregate it, we can understand better who is still currently impacted. And so as you look at this, you can understand here, you know, the differences in the race and ethnicity that these lines represent. And so particularly the Hispanic Latino population, as well as the Black population, you can see were dramatically impacted, with their unemployment rates spiking much higher than any other people. And when we look specifically at Kansas City and not just nationally, we want to understand further about what is happening in our own local economy. So in March, Kansas City unemployment had peaked at 11.3%, which is 4 times higher than the pre-COVID rate. And where are we today? Today, unemployment rates are down for our white and our Hispanic communities. But when you look at the Black community, we're still about 3 times higher in terms of unemployment rates than any other race. That's important because as we talk about strategies, as we talk about how can we impact this and how do we move this forward, it's very important to understand who are we targeting, who is most vulnerable, and really building those strategies around those groups. So again, I want to take a look at the depth of the downturn in terms of industries, and this is here locally. So our arts, entertainment, recreation, accommodation, and food service. Our other service industries, a lot of these are personal services, whether that's, cosmetology, massage, things like that. And then administrative support, waste management, and remediation. All of these were significantly impacted in terms of the loss of jobs that we saw year over year after the pandemic. And as well, we also find that these are some of the fields where individuals that have less than a college degree, are lower wage workers, are currently employed in those industries. And what do we predict is going to happen with these industries? Where will the jobs be and where will the jobs not be? And as we look out into 2025, and our economist, Frank Link at the Mid-America Regional Council, has put together some models and made some predictions about how we will recover. We anticipate that many of these fields will not recover jobs. And those jobs, those individuals will need to look elsewhere. They will need to rebuild their skills, identify new opportunities, and move into new fields, because some of these jobs just will not recover even into 2025. Where we do see recovery happening is down here in the lower areas. We have wholesale, trade, transportation and warehousing, construction, of course, healthcare. We'll continue to see an increase, finance, insurance, and administrative support. So we have to ensure that we are supporting those individuals that were working in these areas to be able to effectively move into some of these other industries and occupations. And then again, as we were looking at it by industry, now we'll drill down on the same thing, pretty much the same data, but looking at it from an occupational perspective. Again, individuals that were employed in food preparation, art and design and entertainment, personal care and service, building grounds, cleaning, maintenance, you can see a significant hit in terms of those occupations. And then again, where those were less impacted, those are the occupations that really require significantly more education, sometimes more work experience as well. And so again, looking to how do we move individuals from these occupations into some of these that are going to be more sustainable as we move into economic recovery. And again, this sort of looks at where will those occupations be? Where will they recover? They will be, of course, in computer, math, and engineering. Those are our technology occupations that are continuing to expand across every industry. They will be in healthcare, construction, and warehouse and transportation as well. Now, this is a snapshot of a site called tracktherecovery.org, and it's a wonderful way to really begin to understand who is recovering and who is not recovering. And so when you look at these three lines, they're really measuring and monitoring this recovery based on low-wage workers being at the blue. Those are the individuals that are making $27,000 or less. Middle wage workers in the green, and our high wage workers in the red. And typically across the country, we are seeing that our high wage workers have recovered. Their jobs are back. Many of those individuals were able, like we are, to work from home, and they are continuing to maintain employment, and they have regained their employment. However, it is the lower wage workers. And as you see here in the United States, as of August, employment rates among workers in the bottom wage quartile decreased by 17.5% compared to January of 2020. So again, this really goes to what are the strategies that we are employing and ensuring that we use data as a means to understand what's happening in our community and our region to effectively develop real strategies. Key facts about this particular recession. The Washington Post said that this recession is the most unequal in modern history. And while the nation overall has regained nearly half of their lost jobs, several key demographics have recovered more slowly. And we see that in the data that I presented. Black men, Black women, Hispanic men, mothers of school-aged children, younger Americans, particularly those that are ages 25 to 34, and people without college degrees. And so we find that people in other demographics, white women, for instance, have recovered 61% of the jobs they lost, while Black women have recovered only 34%, according to Labor Department data through August. And then the same dynamic is seen with college degrees. Workers with college degrees are 55% recovered, compared with less than 40% for workers with high school degrees. And we have the same dynamic again with our low wage workers. So what do we do? How do we begin to move into regional economic recovery? First, we have to understand that with this much unemployment, particularly in those groups that were already most vulnerable, we must help individuals to regain employment quickly. There must be opportunities for that. And so there really is an urgent need to support those unemployed and underemployed adults in the Kansas City metro area. So even prior to COVID, we showed huge disparities in educational attainment. We had 49% of our white adults 25 and up in our region having at least an associate's degree, compared to Blacks and Hispanics at 28% and 25% respectively. Overall, in our region, and this is counting the 9 counties across Missouri and Kansas, there are currently 363,000 adults that are 25 and up that have only a high school diploma. There are 77,500 adults with some high school and no diploma, and there are 312,000 adults 25 and up with some college, no degree. So this really goes to understand the potential. Oftentimes when we look at workforce development strategies, when we look at promoting access to higher education and to ongoing educational attainment, we focus on our traditional student, which is very important, and it is an important aspect. But we want to also understand the potential of our adult workforce and what are we doing to support the adults in our region in moving in the direction of getting more credentials, more skills, and more education. And so those are some of the policies that I know that we are focusing on and that other organizations are focusing on nationally. So again, as we mentioned, 42% of all of the jobs that were lost will be permanent. And we're not even discussing the potential of automation that we know is beginning and is beginning to increase as a result of COVID-19 and will continue to increase, and some predict will be the next industrial revolution of our era. So how will artificial intelligence and automation continue to exacerbate some of these problems that we see now? We have to intervene immediately. And so sustained unemployment will continue to have long-term impacts on our economy. Increased risk of foreclosure, eviction, bankruptcy, emotional health, anxiety, depression, and crime are all related outcomes if people continue to be unemployed. So some of the strategies that communities can begin to implement, economic developers, workforce developers, community advocates, is to create a detailed picture of where jobs are at risk in your community. Again, this goes back to using our data as a tool to help us develop and implement, measure, and track our strategies. So again, looking at things by industry, occupation, understanding the demographics, ensuring that you are disaggregating data by race and ethnicity, income, and geography where possible. You can create a heat map at the city, state, regional levels to really begin to understand those areas that have the most vulnerable populations, where there are no jobs, and where individuals are at the greatest risk. And even when you look at the employer side of the equation, many are uncertain about the skills that they will need and what their hiring needs are, and even what the true skills or aspirations of particularly their frontline staff are. So looking from the employer's perspective is, how do you really use data to help you understand and develop those individuals that are in your current workforce? Especially focusing assistance on those small and medium-sized businesses, which of course account for the majority of the jobs in our region. And then again, focusing on retraining and upskilling those frontline employees. And then again, focusing on those vulnerable people, creating information. Many times communities that are economically and socially isolated don't have access to this information. They don't know which industries and occupations are most impacted, which ones are going to grow. We're sort of in this gray area where people know that they have lost jobs, but there is not a clear and transparent access to this data, to this information about where are the best skill opportunities. How do I move myself from one career to another? How do I navigate this landscape? And how do I find the best training programs even? So ensuring that people have clear information on immediate job openings and skill needs. Two consistent industries and occupation that I am hearing about across the region, both Missouri and Kansas, are warehouse and logistics and healthcare. For many people, and particularly when we look at our adults that come in often with many barriers, whether that's childcare, transportation, other family responsibilities, it's difficult for them to think about committing to an education program that may be 4 years out. How do we move people into immediate opportunities that can fill their immediate needs to provide for their family, but also have that internal flexibility to allow them to continue to grow? And so ensuring that individuals have access to these resources is an important equity component, because if people cannot access the jobs and they don't have childcare, they don't have the financial assistance they need, they cannot get into the jobs. And as I am working with the community and all of the practitioners and the wonderful organizations that are out here working to get people reemployed, they are finding that struggle right now. They're finding that they would assume that people would be beating down their door, knocking down the door to get in, get retrained, get resources, but that's not the case right now. And so this is happening nationally as well. And I think that there are many factors at that. So we need to identify in our region opportunities to create low cost or no cost short-term training in these growing fields. We need to focus on digital literacy and digital access. Not only did we find that this was a significant factor in our secondary education schools as we had to move to virtual learning, but this was also an issue with the heads of the household, with the families who maybe did not have access to broadband internet services. They don't have laptops or PCs in their home. And so there is a significant disconnection. There was already a divide, a digital divide, and this divide is even greater. And again, as we move into a potential fourth industrial revolution that will utilize a fusion of very big technologies, this is going to be and remain to be a problem. Many of our adults don't have the ability to navigate multiple different platforms, whether it's a Mac or a PC and all of the tools. And so building digital literacy, ensuring that people have quality access is going to be a key component in this equity conversation when it comes to employment. We also have to focus on the social and emotional skills and the social and emotional capacity and health of our workforce. Focus on work readiness, and these future of work skills and long-term strategies should focus on, again, reskilling individuals into high demand careers. So looks like I have a little bit of, I don't know what that did right there, but so here's the question. Are our current workforce strategies enough? And this is certainly not to kind of knock the current public workforce system, because in my previous life in the city of county of Denver, I directed the public workforce system. And that consisted of those programs that you may hear about, WIA or WIOA now, which is the Workforce Investment and Opportunity Act. That included TANF, or Temporary Aid for a Needy Family. That included programs like SNAP. And these are wonderful programs that help a lot of people. The challenge is that historically, the current model, the current paradigm has focused on providing job training to individuals in order to close those skill gaps so that they can then move into gainful employment. And these policies from a federal legislative perspective, as well as from a local programmatic perspective, put the onus on the individual. And these are usually individuals that come from the lowest economic backgrounds and have most barriers to employment. So the onus then is on that individual alone to take that training and then move into gainful employment. And oftentimes this does work. However, is it enough? A recent study conducted by Mathematica, which is a national research institute, they conducted a gold standard study. This is a quasi-experimental design to understand if these public workforce programs are indeed effective. And the study found that probably not. After 30 months of enrollment in these types of programs, the study participants that were offered training from the adult or dislocated worker programs did not experience an increase in employment or earnings. And so the question is, what do we need to do to improve these programs? I have, again, much experience and much appreciation and respect for these programs. And so by no means do we need to get rid of them. We actually need more funding, more training, and more skill development. But there are two sides to the coin. There is the people side, developing people, and then there is the business and employer side, much to Andrea's point today. We have to talk and really deal with and incentivize employers and industries to remove structural barriers to employment. And what are those? Those are policies and practices that favor one group and disadvantage another. These can be seen in hiring practices, for instance. And so we have to really encourage and incentivize our employers to examine their hiring practices. For instance, there are often frontline positions or positions that require a few skills, but there'll often be a bachelor's degree that is required for a position that may be paying minimum wage or just above minimum wage. And so really having those conversations that, is a bachelor's degree important? Is it required? Is it necessary? Breaking down some of those barriers so that more people have an opportunity to move into those. There are many other biases in hiring practices, and I think that we maybe have all heard about, discrimination even based on individuals' names if they appear to be too ethnic, or looking at criminal backgrounds and excluding anyone that may have a criminal background, and that really speaks to some of the need to understand the history in your community. And we touched on many of those issues this morning with Andrea's conversation, but understanding that there have been decades and decades of historic racism and discrimination, and that's resulted many times in some criminal background issues. And so we really, again, have to say, are these barriers? Can we do better? Can we remove some of these and provide people, even with just the opportunity to get an interview, and so that they can actually present themselves on an even playing field? And then, of course, this goes on into the organizational culture and speaks to issues around inclusivity and belonging, and really ensuring that employers are doing their part as well to identify some of these structural barriers that are rooted in geographic segregation that has happened particularly in our community for decades. Social isolation, which results in a lack of social networks and other disadvantages. And how do we support people? One of the most important factors in supporting equity employment is for these private sectors to examine, understand these practices, and instill other practices. I think we have to have our businesses getting out in the community, because often there is a perception that I don't belong here, I'm not going to be welcome here. And the more that we can have that community outreach and engagement, opportunity for work experiences, opportunities to get into paid internships, apprenticeships, a variety of non-traditional training models is important in helping to move the needle on this. And then we have to measure and monitor change. And that is measuring and monitoring the effectiveness of our people side of our strategies, these training programs, but also measuring and monitoring change within our institutions, even our institutions of learning, and within our employers and within our industries. So, the employers and the industries have to really use data to understand what is happening in their hiring practices. Are there a disproportionate number of people of color that are applying that are never making it through the application process? Are there a disproportionate number of our frontline staff or people of color that are not moving up into mid-management or higher level management or C-suite or board positions? And then being able to then monitor those change and make innovations and adjustments based on the data that we are finding. Sector partnerships are also important. These are partnerships with industry and business. And there is a huge opportunity here in the Kansas City region for our business partners to become more engaged and more active. There are many, many advisory boards happening across our community, whether those are, with things like our Real World Learning Initiative through the Kauffman Foundation, whether those are advisory boards where people sit on leadership boards with community colleges and universities. But we have to move further. We have to really create broad business engagement and collaboration where we are strategically planning together, understanding what the skill needs are, having these conversations about structural barriers, and providing, again, more creative opportunities for people to move into these jobs. And that is something that, we can see across all of these in-demand sectors, whether that is manufacturing, whether that is warehouse and transportation, or technology. Also, again, and I reiterate again, capitalizing and expanding upon these work-based learning approaches, because people need to earn an income, particularly our adults that we're trying to develop. They have to have an income while they are learning. So, we are finding that employers really are showing an increased interest in these types of models and figuring out ways. Maybe it's not a formal apprenticeship, maybe it is more of a cooperative training model where a community college may be doing some of the front baseline training and education, and then the business will take on more of the technical aspect of this training. It allows for a more flexible approach and really can help employers meet their skill needs by partnering with some of these training institutions to customize these sorts of training model. And again, it also allows students to move quickly into work and earning an income. So I will stop there, and I wanted to open it up to hear your perspectives on this and share any information or ask any questions.
So yeah, so if anyone would like to sort of kick things off by popping a question in the chat, and then we can sort of use that as a prompt to start a conversation. Alternatively, feel free to jump in and just share it off the cuff. Well, if no one's got any questions, I will at this. Oh, here we go. A great question here from Amanda. Would you like to ask your question?
Sure. Thank you so much for your presentation, Anita. I found it very insightful. And I was wondering, I guess, two parts. One, I'm a reader, so I really like to dive into books. If there's anything you recommend in this space, I would love to add it to my list. And then also more specifically, I was curious if there are any cities that you've seen that have really excelled, or anything that we should specifically look to in Kansas City to try to emulate.
Great question, Amanda. Thank you so much. Yes, I could definitely make some recommendations. I think that the study, if you are interested in workforce development policy and workforce development programs, these models are employed by a lot of different organizations, basically job training programs that we hear of so much. The Mathematica study is very interesting to really understand what aspects of those are working and what aspects of those are not. So I'd highly recommend, if you're interested in data and you're a data nerd like I am, take a look at that. And in terms of strategies, I think that one of the greatest opportunities that we have in our region are sector partnerships, are true sector partnerships. And they're very difficult and it takes a long time. As I worked in the Denver community for about 10 years, we were industry focused. We really focused on, like we do here, these targeted sectors: financial services, healthcare, advanced manufacturing. In Denver, it was aerospace, technology, and some of the others. However, we found that we had really a great involvement across a broad number of employers that were actively working with community colleges. They were working with private training programs. They were working with the workforce development. And we had to make significant kind of concessions in terms of like breaking down these silos and bringing these groups together and really getting employers to start doing some of this collective demand planning, where they're really forecasting and looking out collectively and identifying opportunities where we could collaborate. And I'll give you an example. We led a healthcare sector partnership for about 3 years, and we were able to identify that there were individuals that were in frontline positions such as CNA, but they had a need for surgical tech. And this was across several of our hospital systems. And so we were creating an alliance there where we partnered with the Workforce Board to identify funding. And we were able to, at no cost, move individuals from the CNA role into a surgical tech position. And, of course, these partnerships take multiple years, and it really requires some agreement at the C-suite level, of course, that this is important, that we need to do this, and designating teams from their HR to commit to engaging in this process over years of time. So, having the data is one aspect of it, but being able to have collective involvement from a large group of employers, not just the largest ones in the community, but the small, the mid-sized employers, to really drive these sorts of workforce development programs forward over a long time and really open up some of these doors and reduce some of the structural barriers that we see.
So jumping in again, we have another kind of interesting question from Jocelyn in relation to some of the data you've shared today. Jocelyn, over to you.
Shoot, sorry, I was on mute. I just wondered on the job losses that there were a bunch. It seemed like half of the job losses were assumed to be permanent, and I just wondered why that was, what that was based on.
That's based on just fundamental shifts in those particular industries. And so, the assumption, for instance, is that retail was already under great pressure. We know that, malls and some of our bricks and mortar stores were beginning to die, and in many areas had been essentially declining significantly in terms of traffic because of just the shift in the way that was happening. And then e-commerce was beginning to expand and putting further pressure on that particular industry. So once COVID hit, that resulted in, mass closings and loss of many of those positions that would have been in those bricks and mortar locations, and a movement of the sale of goods from bricks and mortar facilities to online. And so, those jobs just will not be replaced, for instance, so that's an example of why those jobs will not come back. But if we look out again and we project forward and we say, what will happen, what may happen in 10 years, studies predict that many of those positions anyway were at high risk, a probability of automating. And so we already know that there is significant pressure, and many people in those occupations probably aren't aware of that, to move people from some of these lower skilled positions and give them the opportunity to develop higher level skills so that they can be effectively in, for instance, technology careers that we know will continue to grow and drive the economy. But how do you do that? How do you move someone that's been working as a food server, a wonderful, honorable occupation, but maybe they don't have those skills? How do you bridge that gap? How do you really take someone out of McDonald's that maybe is laid off now and put them into a opportunity to move into a software development career, move into some sort of a technology career? It is a huge lift.
Thank you.
You're on mute, Alex.
Hi, I have another question here from Vincent. Feel free to go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, Anita. My question is, are there inequities in the outcomes you've noticed for workforce redevelopment?
Absolutely. That is such a great question, because when you really talk about equity, that's where you do see it, is in the outcomes. And when it comes to employment, you have to look at, even if you are bringing in more diverse individuals of a variety of ethnicities and racial backgrounds, are they being paid? Are they being compensated at the same levels that their white counterparts are in the organization? Are they having equitable opportunities for promotion? Are you finding that individuals are, moving up in the ranks that are individuals of color? And that's when you look at the equitable outcomes. We tend to, workforce development typically measures employment, they measure median earnings, and they generally measure retention after a particular point in time that an individual has left their program. Are they able to move into sustainable employment that pays a sustainable wage in the field that they were trained in and retain that position for at least 6 months? And as as I mentioned through the study, the findings for Mathematica looking at this nationally is that that's likely no. And so we have to understand then, what's the other barrier? What are the other barriers? What's the other side? If this individual has gained some skills and training, what is the barrier from keeping them to having those equitable outcomes, from gaining the employment in the field that they were trained in? Oftentimes individuals that are trained end up having to go into a different field because they can't get into that field that they were hoping to move into.
Hopefully we can squeeze in one final question very quickly. I'm going to ask it just because we've got about 90 seconds left. Emily asked, is there any funding opportunities for small businesses that want to hire interns from underrepresented groups and that don't have the payroll capacity? I can also help with this afterwards, but I defer to the expert in Anita.
And I would love to hear your insight on that, Alex, because it's a great question. Economic development incentives for hiring vary from state to state, region to region. Sometimes there are economic empowerment zones, there are hub zones that a business can locate in that will provide them some level of incentive for hiring individuals that live in a particular area and are generally at a lower income level. And those, arguably may not be as effective as they should be, and there could be more. So I would argue that there need to be more incentives. There need to be, the incentives need to be a little more flexible. Businesses need to know more about those incentives so that they do have more of an economic incentive to hire people. Now, also, when I look for instance, as I've worked state to state, and most recently will compare my experience in Colorado to my experience here in Kansas City, workforce development funds, public workforce dollars can be used as economic development incentives. It really depends on, the philosophy and the approach and the implementation in that particular state or region. And in Colorado, we had the privilege of using our public workforce dollars as an economic development. So I would be at the table with businesses that were being attracted into our area to explain to them immediately how our programs could help them recruit individuals, hire and train their current staff, and what we had available. And fortunately, we had millions and millions of dollars of funding in that particular area. And here, when I compare that here, there is not the same approach in terms of the allocation of our public workforce dollars. And so I think that there is some room for opportunity there. There's some discussion there that probably needs to happen and could happen in the local level. So Alex, I'll let you give your expert thought on incentives for this.
I'm far from an expert, more of signpost of information. So the Full Employment Council has different pots of money to essentially allow employers to, to not only take on interns, but also to hire folks on in a sort of apprenticeship form where you take on these new folks that you can train up and develop and almost see if there's a potential fit for after the period that is funded. And essentially how it works is the talent is on the payroll technically of the Full Employment Council, and they're on their workers' comp, et cetera, and it's merely a case where you have to confirm that they've been attending and confirm how it's all been going. So yes, if anyone wants to pursue said opportunities, please feel free to reach out to me at Munyard, that's MUNYARD at edckc.com, and I added my email in the chat. So we got a few more minutes for additional conversation. My question for Anita would be, if we were to evangelize about and properly fund one thing, given the dynamics and the data in the workforce development space and supply and demand and our ability to tackle historic structures of inequity, what would it be and why?
If we were to do one thing,
if we were to deploy kind of one cohesive workforce and economic development strategy to kind of solve some of the fundamental issues that we're facing, what would you choose and why?
Well, I think that, the point that I was trying to get across is that if it is one strategy, it has to be multi-layered and multi-pronged, because, for instance, training individuals alone will not fundamentally create regional prosperity and really move as many numbers of people as we have into more equitable and sustainable employment. So a comprehensive workforce development approach has to have many layers to it. It has to have strong education and outreach for those communities and those individuals that are most in need, really partnering with community organizations, neighborhood associations, faith-based organizations that are serving individuals that are lower income or disadvantaged. It has to truly have employers at the table discussing and working on removing structural barriers. There needs to be more low cost and no cost training opportunities, because quite frankly, many adults cannot afford to pay for training because they have to feed their families. So we have to account for that. And there need to be more employers that are engaged in these in a long-term, comprehensive and consistent way. And there needs to be more work-based learning opportunities. So that to me would round out a very robust and comprehensive workforce development strategy.
Perfect. We're about to move to music and then we'll be going back to the main session, but very, very quickly, we got a great question here from Kendra, which is, based on your research, do you see a need for job training that specifically includes measures to address disability?
Yes. When you say measures to address disability, then I'm assuming that you're meaning physical or cognitive disability. And I wish I could go into this further, but the short answer is yes.